Hello and welcome to Arcade Tirade, the podcast that's all about games. I go by the name Zuve. Let's start the show. So, the first episode is going to be about something that's very special to me. Well, you know, video games in general are special to me, but what I'm going to be talking about today is the SNES, the Super Nintendo Entertainment System. But I'd like to say a couple things about myself first. I've been a gamer longer than any other thing in my life. I'm also a writer and a musician, and I didn't think I'd be doing a podcast, but here I am. So, first I'd like to talk about some of the things that have been going on in the news lately. Of course, we had the Nintendo Direct. That was a few weeks ago now at this point. Although there were some interesting things I would like to touch upon. So, Final Fantasy 7, 9, and 10 are all coming to the Switch. They just said they'd be HD. They didn't specify if they were going to be the same remakes that we saw on the PlayStation. That would be awesome, but I'm not holding my breath. They also announced Final Fantasy 15 Pocket Edition. I've never played 15, but it looks like, I guess if you're a fan, it could be cool. It kind of has like more cartoonish kind of look. When it comes to a series like FF, I'm really not that crazy about that, but, you know, 7 and 9, definitely. Personally, I'm glad I skipped out on 8. There are going to be 20 more classic NES games, and by the way, I heard somebody, upon the day of releasing the NES emulator, had hacked it so that they could play any ROM. But so far there were 10 games announced. Ghosts and Goblins, Excitebike, Tecmo Bowl, Yoshi, Double Dragon, Gradius, Ice Hockey, River City Ransom, Pro Wrestling, and Baseball. Man, I love how simple you could name things back then. You didn't have this Ken Griffey, this Nolan Ryan, you know, Madden 2017. You could just have baseball. What was it? Need I say any more? All right, let's see what else we've got. Final Fantasy 12, forgot to mention that one. The Zodiac Age will be coming next year. Of course, Super Mario Party. Kind of reminds me of the old, speaking of Super Nintendo, the old days where they'd just stick the word super behind everything and suddenly it was better. Kind of like a certain 64 system. Animal Crossing Switch next year. There are going to be classic NES controllers coming out for the console. Yoshi's games called Yoshi's Crafted World. They've got a name now. That'll be out next year. Oh, the cloud saves. Yeah, they talked about the cloud saves. That was a big issue because they weren't guaranteeing that you could save your data through the cloud on all Switch games, and I still haven't seen a guarantee on all games, but for the classic games, if you lose your subscription, you won't instantly lose your cloud saves. You have 180 days to re-enlist. That sounds like the military. You have 180 days to re-enlist, and you can get your save files. They'll remain intact. So that's good news for a lot of the people that were throwing a hissy fit. All right, let's see what else we have going on in news here. PlayStation Mini. So if you've been following this, the PlayStation will be coming with 20 games included on December 3rd, and it'll cost $100. And of course, this follows, again, because Sony, time and time again, has just taken ideas from Nintendo. This follows after the last 2 years' holiday releases of the Super Nintendo Mini and the NES Mini, respectively. So it says the console is going to be 45% smaller than the original, which came out in '94, and it will come with Final Fantasy VII, Jumping Flash, Ridge Racer Type 4, Tekken 3, and Wild Arms for you RPG lovers out there. But they haven't announced anything else yet, so it's kind of been open to speculation. I've heard people say, like, Twisted Metal, maybe Crash Bandicoot, even though they've already just released those remakes on other consoles. Of course, Tomb Raider. Why not Tomb Raider? Or Super Monkey Ball. Was that the name? Super Monkey Ball? The one where you're the monkey in the ball? Yeah. You know what I'm saying. So I'd just like to discuss briefly before we get into it what I've been playing lately. Earthbound and Mother 3. Both great games, both really fun RPGs if you haven't checked them out. Earthbound. Earthbound is a mid-90s Super Nintendo RPG, which I'll actually be talking about in a little bit in this episode. And then Mother 3 is the sequel, which is also another quirky RPG, which we never got here in the U.S., actually. So I've been procuring it through other means, and I've enjoyed the hell out of that one, too. You get to fight cyborg dinosaurs and take down helicopters with psychic abilities, among other things. I won't get too much into detail. There's the Mother series, which Earthbound is part of, is so big online that I would just say check out the guys on starmin.net. I've been checking that site out for a couple decades now. They're amazing. They're super dedicated. They actually started a series of petitions to get a localized version of Mother 3, which to this day still hasn't succeeded, but I digress. Another one I've been playing is Oceanhorn, which has been out for a few years, but was finally released for a system I had, the Nintendo Switch, because I'm such a big Nintendo nerd. And it's very similar. They've taken a lot of elements from Zelda games. It's a top-down perspective. It gets better as you go along. I enjoy it. I don't say it's a great game, but it's a good game. It's a fun game to pass the time with. There's a good amount of exploring to do. If you're into real-time, like retro adventure games, this would definitely be something that you should check out. Okay, now, on with the show then. So, the Super Nintendo. So everybody has a system that they have a bias for, based on when you grew up. My first console was the Nintendo. My mom bought it either before or right around the time I was born. And she tells me I would just sit there and watch her. But I really didn't get into games. My first, true indoctrination into the cult would be the Super Nintendo, which I still think has some of the greatest games in history, and I still get nostalgic. I still get goosebumps when I hear those old 16-bit songs. I know the songs aren't 16-bit, it's the graphics, but just whatever. A little interesting fact, they lived through the golden era of RPGs, the Japanese RPGs, and they have more top-selling RPG titles than any other console on record. Again, the music was just amazing. It blew me away. I mean, so many great titles: Secret of Mana, Final Fantasy VI, Super Mario World, Donkey Kong Country, still classic songs that you hear in rehash versions of those games now, like in Smash Brothers. Smash Brothers has something like 800 hours of music. That could be an exaggeration, but it sounds about right. The system ruled in the 16-bit era, kicked the Genesis's ass. And I'm sorry for all you Sega fanboys out there that are going to get butthurt over hearing that, but those are just the facts. Just look at the numbers. Facts. Don't care about your feelings. The system survived through the 16-bit era and well into the 32-bit era, and globally, by that point, they sold 49.1 million consoles. So I figured we'd start off with the beginning, the history of the console. So we're going to go to the summer of '89, where the 16-bit era began, and that was with the Sega Genesis and the TurboGrafx 16. Now, Nintendo's 8-bit console, NES, was competing against the Genesis and the TurboGrafx, if you even want to call that last one a competition. But in 1988, Nintendo of Japan decides, okay, we need to buckle down and rise up. So they began the development of the Super Famicom, which Famicom is short for Family Computer, for those of you in the States, for those of you ignorant Westerners. The man in charge was Masayuri Uemura. The console was released in Japan in late 1990. The Japanese counterpart had more of a curved design than the American version that we're all familiar with. You know, the boxy one with the purple buttons and the little gray tab in the middle. It's kind of awkward looking, but aren't all consoles. So the North American version, we can thank that to a guy named Lance Barr, who thought it was too soft looking, the Japanese version of the console. He even said it looked like a bag of bread. So it was redesigned and was released in the US as the Super Nintendo Entertainment System in late August of 1991. It retailed for $199.99, which was $50 more than the Genesis, which had just went through a discount at that time. Now, you might be thinking, well, that's not going to work in Nintendo's interest. But you have to consider some things. Unlike the Genesis, the Super Nintendo came bundled with both RF and composite video cables and 2 controllers. And when you adjust the prices, the gap is actually closer to the SNES only being 10% higher. So because the SNES was about twice as pricey as the NES, and due to a lack of understanding to a lot of Westerners, people couldn't understand why they couldn't play the Super Nintendo games on the NES, and saw it as a ripoff. So here we are in 1991, and up until now, Sega has been battling Nintendo with their superior 16-bit system, with superior power and graphics, and something they would later go on to call blast processing, which was never completely revealed. But once the Super Nintendo came out, a real challenge started for the Genesis. So right before the release of the Super Nintendo, Sega released one of their most powerful IPs or franchises to this day, and many people will recognize him right along Mario, and of course that's Sonic the Hedgehog. And this is where the first major console war begins. You might remember, some of the older listeners might remember the old advertising campaign against Nintendo, which says, Sega does what Nintendo don't. So by the end of the first month of the US Super Nintendo release, the Super Nintendo had Super Mario World, Pilot Wings, F-Zero, Gradius 3, and SimCity. All of which are great games. You might disagree with me on some. I don't care. You're wrong. As I'd said before, the SNES lived into the 32-bit era and had quite a long run, longer than most consoles you see today even. In 1999, it wasn't until 1999 that it was discontinued in the US, but even after that, in Japan, South Korea, and Brazil, it lived on. It maintained support until 2003. And that brings it to a total of a 13-year lifespan. Well, most consoles are lucky to get to half a decade these days. So I'd like to talk about some of the more noteworthy games of the console. Of course, you have Super Mario World. I mean, how can you forget that? I mean, it did so many things for platforming that you didn't see before. And look, I'm not trying to say it was... I don't even think it was one of the greatest games of all time, honestly. I think it was one of the best Mario games. I honestly could argue that Super Mario 3 for the Nintendo was better. But let's remember, Super Mario World had the non-linear world map. That was a first for Mario. It had the introduction of Yoshi, who is still one of the most popular characters, and one that I understand the ladies love. You had the cape. I mean, it's a cape. What else do I need to say? The boss battles, yeah, I get they were kind of repetitive, you know, Iggy Koopa, Lemmy Koopa, Windy Koopa. It was all like they recycled the same battles over and over. Some of the levels looked similar, but the colors were amazing. The soundtrack was fun and upbeat. It was just a fun, feel-good game that everybody could get into. Another one I'd like to talk about is Super Castlevania 4. 2 words. 8 directions. Simon Belmont could whip in 8 directions. Of course, if you're not familiar with the Castlevania series, you play as a member of the Belmont family who has to go and kill Dracula every 100 years. And it's a pretty good, I guess you call it a horror game. I guess. No, it is. And you kill zombies, skeletons. The level design is fun. The graphics for the time were really impressive. The replay value, I thought was great. I still play it to this day. Then you have Final Fantasy III, or as some of you purists call it, Final Fantasy VI. I don't know which one I call it. It depends on the weather outside, honestly. It's just a great RPG. For me, that was the first Final Fantasy that I really found playable, to be honest. But I didn't pick that game up until I was probably, I don't know, like 17, 18. Came later in life, after I was a grown man. Grown-ish. It's a fun game. It's a turn-based RPG. That's going to turn a lot of people off. It's outdated, but you have to look at some of these games in the context of the time, too. For a Super Nintendo game, the graphics use Mode 7, which is something I'll touch on later, which was really impressive for the time. It was a huge world, a lot of very interesting characters. It had one of the greatest villains of all time, Kefka. If you don't know who that is, look him up. I'm sorry, Sephiroth fans, but he's better. Let's see, Donkey Kong Country. Donkey Kong Country, though, was one of the most graphically impressive games of the time, and one of the reasons that the Super Nintendo was so successful, and was also the beginning of Rare's long, successful career. The game developer Rare, also known for GoldenEye, Perfect Dark, Banjo-Kazooie, Conker's Bad Fur Day, and I could go on. It's just a fun game. The characters are great. The series is great. It's easy to play, well, at first. Then it gets hard as hell. Chrono Trigger. One of the best RPGs of all time, if you ask me. Not one of the biggest games, but that's not always what makes a game good, obviously. It uses a real-time combat system, and your characters, you can switch in and out throughout the game, and you can combine different abilities to form new abilities in combat based on who's in your party. Again, a lot of great characters, a great soundtrack, another Square RPG. Square was killing in the 90s. I don't know what else to say. Check it out for yourself. And by the way, Chrono Cross, the sequel, is not really a sequel, just so you know. But if you get a chance, check out Chrono Trigger. I'm not going to endorse emulating games, but I will say that buying a copy now is crazy expensive. Kind of like the next game I wanted to talk about, which is Earthbound, which is one that I actually picked up and played again for the first time in probably a decade. This is actually my personal favorite game. It's incredibly quirky. It totally destroyed the stereotype of RPGs being either science fiction or medieval setting. It takes place in a modern-day mock version of America where you fight stray dogs and spacemen. You use weapons like frying pans and bats, and your main posse of characters are a bunch of psychic misfit kids from across the world that go to fight this strange alien Gygus. It was just, and the soundtrack, again, always the soundtrack, was fantastic. And another fantastic soundtrack, they all have fantastic soundtracks, but another one which I still would put in a top 10, maybe a top 15 list of all-time games, Super Metroid. Now, what can I say about Super Metroid that you haven't already heard, unless you haven't heard anything about Super Metroid, in which case I feel sorry for you. It was really the defining game of the Metroidvania style of games, which is a closed world, but it's non-linear, meaning you can access certain areas at first, but you have to backtrack when you get certain items and go to different areas. The game is just ingeniously designed. The layout is incredible. The music, really, it's an adventure game, but in a lot of ways it's also a horror game because the game knows how to build suspense. It knows how to create a dreadful atmosphere, and it also knows how to scare the hell out of you. And you don't necessarily have to play in one route. It's usually suggested that you do, but through years and years of hacking and speed running communities, they've been able to find a million different ways to get through the game. And there are also some secrets in there that aren't explained, but you can find for yourself. It just really creates for an overall free-form type of game. Free-form, not in the loosest sense, but you're able to go around and do a lot more than you're first led on. At the beginning, you're led by the hand in a lot of ways, but there are parts where they let you go to explore for yourself. And it can be frustrating at times, but trust me, it's a great game. And once you really get the hang of it, you can beat it in probably 4 hours. But still, it's a good 4 hours of your time, no matter how many times you've played it. So then there's, well, what would a Nintendo list be of any console without a Zelda game? A Link to the Past. What can I say here? Honestly, this isn't even on the top 3 of my favorite Zelda games. That's how good the series is, though. Again, it's another game where you have a lot of freedom, but you're limited to where you can go. I mean, I have so many good memories. There's so many classic, enemies and dungeons and themes and, don't attack the cuckoos, the chickens, they'll kill you. I think that was actually the first Zelda that had that feature. Next is Street Fighter II. Street Fighter II is the genre-defining game for fighting games. For the one-on-one fighting games. You have classic characters, Dalsim, Blanca, Guile, Ken, Ryu. That's where you get the famous Hadouken! It's just a lot of fun. I don't know what else to say. You got bonus rounds where you can beat the shit out of cars. You fight some, Hitler-Stalin ripoff as the final boss. One more I'd like to talk about is Kirby Superstar, which I hear some people rave about, but personally, not enough people I hear are raving about this game. It came, I believe, you get 6 different shorter games that you can play when you start. And, of course, you play as Kirby, the little pink cream puff character that can copy other creatures' abilities. And you play these different games that have different scenarios, like one where you're fighting a giant bird, that's your mission, one where you're trying to save the Milky Way galaxy, one where you're playing a mining quest and your goal is to gain as many treasures. That was actually a personal favorite. But the real cool part is that as you beat certain games, you can unlock other games. And this is actually the game that spawned the hit song from the Gourmet Race. You'll hear it on, it's the most famous Kirby song, but you'll hear it on Smash Brothers and later Kirby games. Okay, so next I'd like to talk about the graphics and the audio features of the Super Nintendo. So again, the godfather of the Super Famicom, Masayori Uemura, with visual and audio in mind, was opposed to Sega's focus on the processing power. The Super Nintendo can handle 128 simultaneous sprites and 4 layers on screen at one time. And that's a 32,000 color palette, which can show 256 simultaneous colors in a single layer. Well, that's depending on the graphics mode, which there are 8 of, numbered 0 through 7. And of course, again, mode 7 being the most famous, which has the 3D-like effect where you're basically moving through a blank space, but there's a horizontal, or rather a what do you call that? You're looking at a 45-degree angle down at the backdrop, which gives it a 3D effect, which was something really cool for the time. And you can see it in games like F-Zero or, again, Final Fantasy VI Overworld. The sound was 8-channel and 16-bit. Oh, so I was right about the sound being 16-bit. But anyway, this came from 2 chips working together, one which was designed by Sony. Interestingly, that chip was supposedly designed in secret by Ken Kutaragi, who would go on to become the father of the PlayStation. We'll get to that in a minute. So I'm not going to play any of the songs here for copyright reasons, but I'd like to I'd like to list off some of the games which I thought had some of the best soundtracks on the Super Nintendo. First you have ActRaiser, which was developed by Enix in 1990, which was like a town-building platform action-based hybrid where you play as God, and that's always fun. Again, Chrono Trigger, Donkey Kong Country, Mega Man X. How could I forget Mega Man X? I should have put that on the list. That's another great game. Check that out. In fact, there's a compilation on the Switch that came out for the first 4 Mega Man X titles. I would definitely recommend it. I believe that's going for $19.99. Secret of Mana, Super Metroid. Pretty much the internet agrees with me on that one. Just a brief aside, I'd like to talk about the Super Nintendo controller. In a lot of ways, it was groundbreaking and set the curb for controllers in the future. So for the NES, you basically had this rectangular block. 2 buttons, and then a start and a select, and a direction pad. The Super Nintendo was the first console to have shoulder buttons, which you'd later see in other consoles, like the PlayStation, the Xbox, and pretty much every console afterwards. It was more designed for the shape of the hand, much better than any console before it. And again, if you look at the history of Nintendo compared to Sony later on, although when the PlayStation came out, it kicked the shit out of the Nintendo 64. Eventually, in some ways, the tables turned, and it was Sony that started copying some of the technology and peripherals of the Nintendo. Or of Nintendo, I should say. Although all is not rainbows and sunshine with the Super Nintendo. And at this point, I'd like to talk about some of my issues that I have with the SNES and what many consider to be some of the greatest mistakes that Nintendo made during the 16-bit era. So if we go back to 1988, I'd like to talk about a blunder that Nintendo went through with Sony. So the two companies announced in that year that they would work together on developing a CD-ROM technology for video games. And ironically, this included the audio chip which the Super Nintendo would end up using in the end. But the two companies worked out plans for a cartridge/CD console that was dubbed the PlayStation. Now, bear in mind that at that point it was 2 words instead of 1, which the Sony PlayStation would end up using. As the system's announcement grew closer, however, Nintendo got cold feet. Now, Nintendo was very controlling about the third parties that worked with them at that time, and they were starting to get worried about how much control Sony would have over the CD-based games. They were afraid that Sony would be able to use this control as leverage to force their way into the industry. So basically, Nintendo was continuing its attempt of their iron grip on the industry and developers. So behind the scenes, Nintendo ended up making a deal with a rival company to Sony, Philips, and their plan was to develop a CD-based add-on, well, like they were going to with Sony, but instead with Philips. And with this deal, Nintendo would retain every right to the games, and in exchange, Philips could use Nintendo's franchise or intellectual property on their console, which would be dubbed the CDI. So at the 1991 Consumer Electronics Show, Sony announced their PlayStation plans. However, the next day, Nintendo said that they were going to be working with Philips instead and didn't regard Sony at all. And so, in retaliation, Sony created their own division called Sony Computer Entertainment and began planning the release of their own console. Of course, this ended up being Nintendo's worst nightmare in the late 90s, as we all know how the Nintendo 64 PlayStation rivalry ended. So in the end, Nintendo's CD add-on was scrapped, but Philips retained the right to use Nintendo's franchises. And if you haven't seen the CDI Zelda games, let's just put it like this. Nintendo still to this day pretends that they don't exist. My other big beef with Nintendo around this time, and this is something which has echoed from this point forward throughout all of their history to this very day, is what I call the Mortal Kombat blood fiasco. So Mortal Kombat, of course, another groundbreaking fighting game, which many see as superior to the slightly more cartoonish Street Fighter II, was released on both consoles, but there was a major difference. So first, a little bit of background. It didn't just start here, but Nintendo was known for being very controlling with third-party developers, as I've said before. They limited the amount of violence in games, as well as other controversial images such as anything that was related to religion or a lot of other controversial topics at the time. And Mortal Kombat, as many knew from its original arcade incarnation, was not only one of the most popular games ever, but was also one of the goriest games ever, enough to catch the attention of Senator Joe Lieberman when that whole rating system fiasco was happening during the 90s. But that's a whole nother conversation. So, again, it had over-the-top gore. The finishing moves were insanity, which included things such as dismemberment, ripping spines out of people's backs, just disintegrating the whole body into a cloud of blood dust, among other things. And all of these features were included in the Genesis version, but not the Super Nintendo. Nope. All that blood was replaced with sweat and water. We didn't want any danger. We didn't want any, oh my God, what is this, with the Super Nintendo? So in the end, the Genesis version outsold Super Nintendo's 4-1. And Nintendo didn't change their policies, for the most part, after this point. And because of that, they really began to carry this image of the elementary school console, the PC nerfed console. Of course, as I mentioned before, this started Senator Herb Kohl and Joe Lieberman's investigations into video game violence, which would result in the creation of the ESRB rating system. And furthermore, this would start Nintendo down the path of being labeled the kiddie video game company, which is a badge that they still wear today. And finally, I'd just like to touch on some of the oddities, some of the add-ons for the Super Nintendo. Some for the better, some for the worse. First, the Super Game Boy, which I thought was an overall plus. It was this larger cart that you could stick in the Super Nintendo, and it had a slot for Game Boy games which you could put in, and you were allowed to customize the game's colors, which was a first, because before that, Game Boy games were just black and white or black and yellow. And so you could use large palette of colors to customize the colors of the game. You could use different frames for the edges of the screen, and some games had extra interactive features, and you could doodle on top of the screen. I mean, who doesn't like that? The mouse pad. As far as I'm aware, the mouse pad was only usable with one game. That was Mario Paint, which was a fun game. It was, for a lot of kids, an introduction to MS Paint. And a lot of those kids, I'm sure, went on to start careers in graphic design. The Super Scope, which was sort of like the spiritual successor to the NES's Zap Gun, the light gun. Instead, though, this was a bazooka, which you aimed at the screen, and you had a couple games that supported it. The Super Scope 6, which really wasn't all that great, and then Yoshi's Safari, which you don't really hear about much today either. So I really think that technology dated both of those games. And that pretty much covers it. So come and check us out next time. We'll be talking about more video games, more topics, and soon I will be having another host on here just to make things more interesting. So have a good day, and come and check us out next time.